touched on a lot of issues, specifically the nexus of race, culture, and you spoke a bit about identity. I wanted to discuss a bit about the story of the average African American in the United States who is not aware of his or her roots and does not have that background to rely on or that immediate homeland to call home. How were you able to reconcile that with your African American friends growing up in the United States? And how do you see the difference growing up with an identity?
He wrote these series of poems called the Duino Elegies. And so the book begins with these little 3 lines of poetry. And it says, "You still don't understand. Throw the emptiness in your arms out into that space we breathe. Maybe birds will feel the air thinning as they fly deeper into themselves." And I read that poem for the first time on September 11th in New York. And I was, my roommate and I lived in Brooklyn, and we could see the towers outside of our balcony. And we woke up that morning just as the first planes had hit. And we spent, those sort of days in shock. And a lot of friends came over to our house, and we began doing this. My friend was also works in poetry, and he's a writer as well. And so we began this exchange of poems. And so we just started pulling out poems from our library. We had a great library at the time. And he he's read the Duino Elegies first in German and then in English, and then we did that kind of all day long. It was the first time I'd come across those poems, and that particular expression stayed with me. Over the next few years, I used to have the whole poem memorized. Now I can only memorize those parts. But there's something in that sentiment that's quite difficult to understand. It's a very difficult poem for me to still understand. But the more I thought about it, the more it seems what the poem aims for, at least in those moments, is to argue that you take the kind of suffering and the sort of pain, both good and bad, that you feel in your life, and you can release it. You can, in this case, almost physically release it as an expression. The release for Rilke is actually happening in the poem, in the act of writing. But in that release into the air, throw the emptiness in your arms out into that space we breathe, there will be something that transforms that pain, something that transforms that suffering, and it becomes something else when it becomes a product of the world. In this case, the birds will actually take that air, and they'll feel the air inside of their wings as they fly. And because I think part of that was that there was that emptiness in New York at that time, that poem seemed to kind of capture. And then throughout the novel, the characters are looking for these open spaces. It begins in the Midwest, and as the characters are driving through the Midwest, there's this sense of wanting to release their frustration with life, the emptiness, into that great open Midwestern space. And so the novel kind of constantly comes back to this idea of how to unburden ourselves. And I think writing and telling narrative is another form of that release.
I would like to know if there is any writer that influenced your professional orientations or you consider as a guidance for you?
Oh, many. I mean, I began writing because I began reading. I think the first thing that sort of made me happy being alone in my life was literature. So at the same time that I was kind of using Ethiopia to help give me an identity, literature ended up doing the same thing. I found a great amount of, by the time I was like 16, 17, I really didn't feel like I needed anybody around me in this bizarre way. I've gotten over that feeling, fortunately, because it doesn't really work. But I carried books with me all the time. I carried books and poetry with me all the time, ranging from later on in my life, Rilke, to Emily Dickinson, Ralph Ellison, James Baldwin, Ernest Hemingway, I mean, Shakespeare, the sort of most literature across the world that I've read has all of those kind of books have stayed with me, and they still stay with me every time I can't. If I can't write, then I just basically go to a book and I read. I mean, it's maybe a book I've read a dozen times before, maybe it's a new novel, but I've never kind of moved more than 5 feet away from my house without a book.
When the issue of clash of cultures is raised with me, I usually say that I'm a blend of 4 cultures, Amazigh, Berber, Arabic, American, and French. And I add that none is clashing with the other.
Yeah.
It seems that it's the same with you. But the question I ask is, can the place where you elect to reside permanently alter the balance between the various cultures you may have assimilated?
That's a good question. I agree with you. There isn't a class, but I think I've no longer any divisions between my sort of American or Ethiopian identities or my African American, Black American identity, because I chose to stop fighting with because I've chosen not to let anybody else define me. And so now any name, title, ethnicity somebody wants to grant me, to me is irrelevant. My identity has been formed, as you said, out of all of these places. And so for me, they exist in their entirety and in their complexity inside of me. I don't have to defend Ethiopia or its relevance to me any more than I feel like I have to defend America and its relevance to me. Being now in France, actually, it is interesting because I think it does change. Because in France, I'm sorry for les Français ici. I'm not saying anything critical. I think it's quite obvious. But there's a very different. I have a very different identity in France that I've come to terms with, which is one. My American identity is what precedes me first. My identity as a writer is also kind of precedes me first, and that's a completely different space that, say, if I were coming from a former French colony, if I were coming from Senegal or Côte d'Ivoire, where that French colonial legacy and identity, I think, ends up being the first thing that people are aware of and they notice. And so my identity is privileged, very much so, in Europe, because it's attached to an American construction behind it. And that construction is very much one of a kind of European French romanticism of African Americans, but two, very much also an economic one, about the fact that if you are an expatriate in America or in Europe, you are, by and large, you're able to do so because you have the financial means. There's a British writer who made a good joke. He said, Americans and British, when we go anywhere in the world, we're expatriates. Anybody else goes in there an immigrant. I'm not an immigrant in Europe. Why, I don't know, but it's true. And that definition is very much, it's an economic and it's a political one. So.
Just thinking about other books and the very, very thin line between fiction and biography, and I'm thinking of books like, 1,000 Little Pieces or things like that, where people, they switch one thing and suddenly it becomes my story and it becomes suddenly so much more, I don't know what the word, marketable, maybe.
It's true, actually. I would be better off if I said this was nonfiction by far.
Yeah, exactly.
I would be much better. Damn. Now that,
Sorry, I couldn't.
you should have been advising me like a year earlier, but.
Sorry about that. But I was wondering if you could kind of comment on that weird line and how much, I guess whether you think it's really such a well-defined line, and I don't know, what's the word I'm looking for?
Yeah.
Ethics, yeah.
I mean, for me, there are small biographical details, but by and large, what happens, is nothing at all like my life, The father and mother who have this very violent relationship, fortunately for my parents, because of these biographical details, are in a state of constant defense. And so I give a reading, and sometimes I'm almost waiting for my father to stand up at first and say, one, I'm not dead. Two, I don't beat my family. When I showed my father the copy of my first novel, and he read the back, the jacket, and it talks about the father, my father's always dying in these books. My father's still very much alive. But he reads the passage where it says, after the death of the father, and my father turns to me and he says, but I'm not dead. Of course you're not dead, Dad. And so the distinction's quite large. I borrow and I steal from my life, of course, in its details, and I use those details to create history, to create fiction. And because I actually really believe in fiction. I believe literature and that fictive and that sort of space that fiction makes, making a space for our imaginations. You know, like I tell stories to my little children, and they are completely unconcerned with what's real or not real. The more fantastic, the better, because their brains are engaged with that ability to conceive of something else other than their own limited identity. Fiction is that argument that we can inhabit other identities other than ones we are born in. The world would seem like such a small place if I couldn't somehow step into the narrative that takes place, you know, 600 years ago, or that takes place in a different culture and a different language. You can do that, of course, through nonfiction, but nonfiction, you're still confined to the perspective of the person who's telling that story. Fiction allows a writer to take on any personage that they want. They can write from male, female, child, animal, dog, Japanese, you know, Vietnamese, whatever perspective they want, all in the same book if they're good enough to do so. And so nonfiction has its great value. I read tons of it, but I won't, you know, even if I knew I could make $1 million more out of my books by, you know, pushing its kind of autobiographical sides more, I refuse to, because I think it's the fiction inside of it that makes me want to write. My own personal story is quite boring to me, actually. Like, I came to America, I went to a good university, great. Like, that's about it. I live in France. A few other things have happened, but.
Do you have any advice for young students who are interested in starting a career in writing, or for teachers who teach creative writing and want to encourage their students to explore this world of fiction and to really understand that the opportunities and the possibilities are endless? What advice do you have to give to them?
I mean, there's obviously the first advice, which is, of course, reading. That's, you know, you can say that 1,000,000 times. It's the truth. It begins with reading. But I think the second part that I think people, when they kind of begin, that makes people love writing. That also, I think, by and large, then it makes them love reading, is when you realize that you can, there's a miracle about an empty piece of paper, which is that empty piece of paper allows you to pretty much write and say anything you think or feel of. And you can destroy that a minute later, you can guard it and you can keep it. But within that space, within that sort of like small confined space, the world is pretty much infinite. You know, there's an enormous amount of things that can happen on that page. And that's the sort of